Right, thanks very much for that introduction, and thanks very much for having us here, and for having me here, sorry, I should say. I just want to say, I guess, a little bit more about myself, just to kind of set the thing up in terms of my areas of interest. I'm a freelance education journalist, writing about the subject since 1997, and I guess my philosophy as a reporter is to investigate detail. I'm not a great fan of ideology personally. The key thing for me is to look at the intricacies of how policies work out on the ground before helping people to try to reach a judgment on whether they're improving things or making them worse. In recent years, I've had two particular interests in terms of education policy. The first has been the interaction of the accountability system in schools, that is league tables, Ofsted inspections, targets, performance pay, and the whole gamut of results-driven performance monitoring mechanisms with what goes on in the classroom. As has been mentioned, I wrote a book on this subject, published in 2007, because I was concerned about the side effects of the huge pressures on schools to raise their results. The second aspect, which I found myself writing about a lot in recent months and years, has been the future of the school system as a whole, attempts to reform the structure of the way schools are organised and their potential implications. These then are my areas of specialism, I suppose, and will inform what I want to say to you now. So that's enough about me. What should I say about the prospects of rising or falling inequality under this still relatively new coalition government? Well, the first thing to note is that coalition ministers speak about this subject a lot. They may not use the term equality, but speeches in which they present a position promoting what could be presented at least as a version of social justice have been frequent and superficially at least passionately argued. So, announcing the introduction of the pupil premium, a scheme through which schools are now receiving a specific sum for every free school meals pupil they educate, Michael Gove said children from poorer backgrounds are falling further and further behind in the qualifications race every year. He added, they are effectively condemned to ever poorer employment prospects, narrower social and cultural horizons, less by way of resources to invest in their own children, and thus a cycle of disadvantage and inequality is made worse with every year that passes. I could quibble actually with his evidence for this statement, but we'll leave that for now. Here is a man, it would seem from what he said there, very committed to equality or justice for pupils from poorer backgrounds. In November, on the BBC's Question Time, Gove said, slightly fuller quote than is up there, how can we ensure that we end the patronising twaddle of the last 30 years that assumes that just because kids come from working class backgrounds, they cannot succeed in academic subjects? One of the reasons I am in politics is to make sure that we transform our education system so that kids who have been written off in the past at last have the chance to succeed. Right, the following quote is from the introduction by David Cameron and Nick Clegg to last autumn's White Paper, which paved the way for the education bill now going through Parliament. As you can see, it says, now no country that wishes to be considered world class can afford to allow children from poorer families to fail as a matter of course. Other examples, including this month's speech by Nick Clegg on social mobility, are not hard to find. Here is a government, you would think, if you take this stuff at face value, that is really committed to making a difference to young people at the bottom of society's heap. Rhetoric should not be ignored, I think. A government which was not even paying lip service to these issues would be treated differently from one that was. But rhetoric is not, of course, the key to this question. The central test is what effect the policies being enacted by this government, whether under the guise of a claimed commitment to social justice or not, actually have. And there are, I think, looking at the areas I specialise in, plenty of reasons to be sceptical about whether that alleged commitment to a version of social justice is really being followed through in the detail of the policy. As I say, there are several reasons to think this, looking at a few policies in turn. First, the overriding ideological philosophy of this government is to move towards a world in which schools are seen largely as individual institutions competing against each other for custom from pupils. Crucially, in this environment, regulation of the measures some schools will undoubtedly take to try to get a better off intake is being watered down in the education bill currently going through Parliament. As I wrote for The Guardian last month, the powers of the school's adjudicator to oversee the admissions process, ordering schools to revise their admissions policies in any way he or she chooses should they be found to be breaking the rules, are being reduced. Commenting on this before he stood down as chief schools adjudicator, Ian Craig said that it seemed that ministers simply wanted to trust schools more. Yet, in a culture in which individual schools remain under huge pressure to raise their exam scores, the temptation for some to push the boundaries on admissions to try to get a more middle-class intake must surely be great. One chair of an admissions forum told me he was aware of a secondary school that leafleted parents at, in quotes, middle-class primary schools to encourage them to get their children to take an aptitude test to enter this secondary, but had not leafleted schools serving council estates. Other schools had expensive school uniforms which were hard for poorer pupils to afford, and thus might put off applications from these families. Maggie Atkinson, the Children's Commissioner, reportedly warned the committee scrutinising the Education Bill that its changes risk adding to the social segregation and stratification of schools. Do ministers care? Well, if they do, I think other factors, such as giving schools more freedom over admissions, are seen as more important. On admissions, the bill will also see the end of a requirement for local authorities to set up admissions forums which consider the fairness of admissions rules across an area. Ruth Greenan, a parent on East Sussex's admissions forum, said, "If admissions forums go, we are going to see an explosion in the numbers of children who are vulnerable missing out." Several other organisations submitting evidence to the Bill Committee, including Save the Children, MENCAP, the Admissions Campaign Group Comprehensive Future, and Accord, a coalition of faith and non-faith groups, made similar points. Yet the bill has remained unchanged on admissions. Sir Alan Steer, a former head teacher who was the Labour government's behaviour advisor, linked schools pushing the boundaries on who they admit to the pressures they face through school accountability over their exam results. He said most school leaders behave honourably and in accordance with the admissions code. Some do not, and in a culture of high accountability, it is naive to assume that poor practice will not increase. Results pressures on schools and weaker regulation of what those schools do on admissions looks to me to be a pretty toxic combination if the goal is to reduce rather than to increase social segregation within education. Second, I think there is another danger of increased stratification emerging in what the coalition is doing in relation to accountability and league table policy. The introduction to a lot of media coverage in January of a new English Baccalaureate GCSE league table measure has already had effects, with anecdotal reports of some schools removing pupils from courses not included within this measure after they had started them. This is yet more evidence, I think, of the power of the rankings in the English education system, and shocking, I think. But I think an interesting or worrying aspect of the English BAC performance measure is that it is being introduced in all schools alongside other targets which will affect only some of them. The coalition has decided to keep the floor targets, controversially used by Labour, to try to improve the exam results on centrally published measures of primary and secondary schools at the bottom of the league tables. So in March, Michael Gove wrote to local authorities asking them for improvement plans for schools below these performance levels, which in secondaries are defined as fewer than 35% of pupils achieving 5 or more A-star to Cs, including English and Maths. Lurking in the background are threats by government to turn schools failing to rise above this level into academies. So you see this quote, it's quite actually sort of centralising and quote there, "I cannot allow underperforming schools where children are not receiving the education they deserve to carry on unreformed," and that's the basis, on the basis of raw GCSE and test scores. This sets up, in my mind, an obvious danger of segregation in what schools serving pupils from richer and poorer backgrounds prioritise. Those with better results, usually in better off areas, may now choose to focus on the more, in quotes, academic English Baccalaureate measure, which assesses pupil performance in English, Maths, 2 sciences, a language and history or geography. Those with lower results, often in poorer areas, would have to focus on the measure that is the key to their future, I think. 5 or more GCSEs, including English and Maths. The risk is that the curricula on offer differ markedly between schools in different areas and facing different pressures. One thing to say briefly also about the English Baccalaureate measure in relation to academies. Most academies actually do very badly on this measure. Nearly a third had 0% achieving the English BAC benchmark in the first set of league tables published in January. Michael Gove, for all his stated anger about pupils from poorer backgrounds failing to get access to the kind of academic curriculum he favours, has said nothing about this except on one occasion when pressed by a reporter. That does tend to underscore the hypothesis that for this government, ideology In this case, ideology saying that academies as a way of organising schools are always best tends to trump any other concern. Third, there is the issue of funding. Labour did pump an awful lot of money into schools, in particular those in the inner cities. It is complicated to track the exact effects of what is happening under this government and funding, but the auspices do not appear to this observer to be as good in terms of equality as that pupil premium policy would suggest. Consider first the pupil premium itself. This is giving £430 for every pupil eligible for free school meals to schools across England. That per pupil figure will rise every year until the end of the Comprehensive Spending Review in 2015. So far, so good, you might think. But how will it really affect schools' budgets? Well, I have done a little calculation myself, and it seems that the pupil premium is not going to be large enough to compensate for the real terms cuts coming schools' way over the next few years, at least for the vast majority of schools. This is quite complicated, but bear with me. What we know about school funding at the moment is that the basic amount schools get per pupil is being frozen in cash terms over the next 4 years. The pupil premium is then added on top of that base to help give some schools an increase enough to keep up with inflation. By my calculations, and they are, I must admit, that's slightly back of the envelope, but by my calculations, making an assumption that inflation over the coming years continues at its current rate of 4%, a school would need more than 50% of pupils on free school meals for its budget to keep pace with inflation. But there are, of course, only a small number of schools in that position with so many free school meals pupils. There are only 100 of England's 3,070 secondary schools in that position, for example, and fewer than 700 of England's 15,000 primary schools in that position. So, for all but a very small proportion of schools with the most pupils on free school meals, there will be cutbacks to schools' real core budgets. Now, as mentioned, Labour certainly spent a lot of money improving the resources of schools in poorer areas of the country. Research by the Institute for Fiscal Studies looked at this and found what looks to me to be a huge increase in funding going to schools attended by lots of children on free school meals in recent years. There was an implicit, as they call it, pupil premium for each child on free school meals of £2,460 for each primary pupil and £3,370 for each secondary pupil as of 2009, the IFS found. I must admit, when I read that, I thought these are staggeringly large figures, but you know, they do know their stuff, so I have to take that as read. This calculation was based not on money specifically allocated to free school meals pupils, but by looking at the budgets of schools with large numbers of FSM pupils who benefited from general government grants targeting deprivation and comparing them against those with few such pupils. The research found that this implicit premium rose by 69% in primaries and 53% in secondaries in the years 2006 to 2009. Given this complexity, I think it's very difficult to be sure that many schools in poorer areas are going to have even real-term standstill budgets overall as a result or after considering the pupil premium. Also, on funding, it needs to be said that schools which have become academies over the past year have been citing potential financial benefits of this policy, which appear to dwarf the cash on offer through the pupil premium as one of its main attractions. Now, because the government targeted its academies policy over that time at already successful institutions, those deemed at least good with outstanding features by Ofsted, there is the danger that this policy could also advantage schools in well-off areas. Finally, of course, I've spoken here only about schools' core budgets. I have not mentioned the non-frontline services provided by local authorities, such as school improvement, libraries, music services, and a host of others. Cuts to these services are already having an impact, of course, with local authorities serving poorer areas, I think, among the worst hit. You'll also notice that I've not said anything specifically about issues such as the education maintenance allowance or tuition fees, since these aren't areas I've looked into in detail, but I would expect other speakers to touch on these. And I would also, as mentioned, I would also direct anyone to look at ATL's policy paper on this, which I thought was very impressive. Summing up then, I think there are many reasons to be worried about inequality rising under this government. Although it claims to be serious about this issue, the reality so far is, I think, to be generous, a risk that rhetorical priority is not translating in the detail of policy to actions a government which was deeply committed to this agenda above all else would be taking. Committed in rhetoric to changing things for the better for children in poorer areas then, but committed in reality, we should all be very sceptical.